Great. Hello, everyone, and welcome. Thank you for joining us in our continued discussions on the application of behavioral science in the UN system. My name is Mary McLennan. I'm a behavioral scientist by training, and I lead what's called the UN Behavioral Science Group, which is an initiative of the UN Innovation Network. So essentially what we aim to do is to bring together over 600 UN colleagues from across the system from more than 40 entities in 60 countries, so quite a bit of breadth and depth, and really aim to promote the application of behavioral science in a variety of ways. So to note, I lead this group alongside my colleague Johanna Joachim, who runs the UN Innovation Network more broadly, and she's joined us today as well. So for those of you who are keen to join the group and you haven't done so just yet, you can do so by clicking on the link that should appear in the chat soon. We welcome colleagues from across the UN, no matter level of expertise, from brand new to behavioral science through to technical trained. There's a space for you no matter where you are along that spectrum, as well as colleagues outside the UN. So you can join in an observer role. We have colleagues from governments, international organizations, academia, the private sector, civil society. So there's lots, there's many other areas as well. Okay, so in terms of the webinar itself today, I just wanted to situate it in terms of the broader UN Behavioral Science Week, which is taking place obviously this week. We have more sessions happening today, tomorrow, as well as Friday. They include COVID-19 vaccination, peace and security, as well as a discussion with Professor Cass Sunstein. So there's lots more going on. I encourage you to check out the agenda if you haven't done so already. As well, this week launch is an important week for the UN, as we have launched 2 key documents. So the first is the UN Secretary General's Guidance on Behavioral Science, which covers key areas and ways in which behavioral science can be progressed in the UN system. We also launched the UN Behavioral Science Report, which highlights experiences from 25 entities and a number of enablers regarding the application of behavioral science across the UN. So check out those 2 documents. They were published by the UN Innovation Network, Johanna and myself, as well as we're hosting the week overall. So if you have any questions, feel free to let us know. Okay, so on to the webinar for today. Just a quick note about logistics. If you have a question throughout, we will have an audience Q&A session at the end. So put your question in the Q&A box in the chat, which you can find at the bottom. Sorry, the Q&A box, not the chat, the Q&A box. And there you can also upvote questions of your colleagues. So if you don't have a question yourself, please look at it and upvote others as well. Okay, so on to the session for today. We are very fortunate to have with us someone who needs very little introduction to the UN. Professor Richard Thaler, who won the Nobel Prize in 2017 for his work, foundational work in behavioral economics. I think it's fair to say that we probably wouldn't be here today and have a report with 100 case studies from across the UN and have the UN Secretary General's guidance without the work of Professor Thaler. So very, very happy to have him with us today. His research focuses in the areas of behavioral economics as well as finance, and really looking at the psychology of decision-making and the gap between psychology and economics overall. You may recognize him from his book, which has been highly influential in the public sector, particularly when it comes to behavioral science, Nudge, which was released in 2008 and co-authored with Professor Cass Sunstein. I'm happy to say there'll be a new edition of this book coming out this summer. It will be called Nudge, the Final Edition, with a number of new ideas, as well as ways of applying behavioral science with some different examples and case studies as well. So I encourage you to check that out when it comes out. But in the webinar today, we will touch upon some of these topics as well. So you get a bit of a sneak peek in terms of what will be in the book shortly published. Okay, so with that, I just wanted to start with some questions. So thinking about where we came from, starting from there in the field of behavioral science, it's quite well known that you've been involved in the early days of behavioral science application in government. So thinking back to say 2007, 2008, 2009, kind of the earlier days, I may not have the years correct, but around then. What was it, particularly for colleagues who are new to the field, who kind of learned what it is during UN Behavioral Science Week, it's the first time they've heard about it. What was it like in those early days? As well as just sort of how did it start overall, and are you surprised with where we are now in behavioral science, given where your thoughts were back then?
Well, certainly when Cass and I were writing our book, we never could have imagined that this conference would be going on at the UN, or really that anyone would read the book. And I should say that publishers shared that view. Publishers ran away from us in droves when we presented the idea of writing this book. So it's all been a pleasant surprise to us. Maybe, you know, the first really hands-on experiences I had were in the UK in 2010, when David Cameron was elected Prime Minister. He had a young aide named Rohan Silva, who had gotten an early copy of Nudge and had, I think, bought up the entire supply in London, which was probably 10 copies, and piled them up in the Tory headquarters, as serving as a nudge. And David Cameron happened to pick up one of them. And much to our surprise, shortly after they took office, they announced the formation of a behavioral insights team that David Halpern took over and started running. And in that first year, and in the early years, I was participating quite actively, and especially in some of the early meetings. And one thing I would say that I think is the most important thing for policymakers, or for us behavioral scientists, when you're in one of those meetings, is you can't come in and say, you know, we've got the answers. And you do that, and the meeting might as well end right there. The early discussions have to be listening and have to be finding out what the problem is that the department is struggling with, and then being open to all possible ways of addressing it, and then insist on testing, because not everything works. Nothing works exactly the way you expect. And so we've been adamant about, if you're going to do something, you try the best you can to measure the results. If at all possible, you run a randomized control trial. And I will say, and I was just actually having a conversation like this with Stephen Dubner yesterday on the Freakonomics podcast, and he was reminding me that he spent a day with me in London once, sort of tagging along on these meetings with various ministers, and he was saying that his reaction was, he was surprised at how kind of charmed and open most ministers were to this idea. The idea that somebody was coming and offering to help. I guess that was unusual to them. So it was nice to hear that from an independent third party. And so, you know, the behavioral insight team initially was 5 people in the UK. It's now over 200 with offices around the world. So, and, you know, we never would have expected anything to be happening in the United Nations. So, yeah, we wouldn't have forecast this.
Well, that's helpful to know. So thinking about the UN system, of like pulling this back into some of the conversations we have with UN colleagues now, as I said, there are pockets of the UN where there's a lot of work. There are pilots, there are RCTs, there are people with expertise, and then there are pockets of the UN where there's very little kind of, it's a very new topic. So colleagues often come to us with questions. How do I talk about this to my manager or to the senior leader who I have in the room with me? Whether you have data and just show the impact or the opportunity cost, you can kind of do that, or others. Are there ways you frame behavioral science? There are rooms that are quite receptive, but in rooms that maybe aren't as open to thinking differently and experimentation. How do you have any suggestions on how to talk about behavioral science overall that could be useful to colleagues?
Well, I think I would say the first step is to stress that whatever policy you're working on, and there are no exceptions to this, whatever policy you're working on involves people. And inevitably, what you're trying to do is somehow get people to change what they're doing in some way that's helpful. So it could be reducing the risk of some disease. It could be reducing carbon emissions. It could be, reducing crime. You name it. Whatever the problem is, there is no problem that doesn't involve people. And even if there's technology involved, I would say, especially when there's technology involved, the thing that most often is missed is that the technology is for people. So we don't, we don't just turn some switch on and then all of a sudden all the problems are solved. So, we've all had the experience of using some interface online that is clunky. And, I'm sure we're on Zoom today, and now it feels like second nature. This is like answering the phone. But in the early days, how do you raise your hand? And it used to be, you had to click on participants to raise your hand. Whose idea was that? And how was anybody supposed to figure that out? So if you de-emphasize the word behavioral science and emphasize the words people, then I think you get it down to a level that really no one can object to. Yes, there are people. And yes, we need people to do more of X and less of Y. And we should be open to ways of achieving that. And of course, the philosophy that Cass Sunstein and I proposed with this clunky term libertarian paternalism, which was a phrase I admit that I chose in order to annoy certain colleagues. So it's not the most friendly term, but the idea of it is there are lots of ways we can make the world better without forcing anybody to do anything. And often it's just by making things easier. And the phrase I used to say most often in those early meetings with ministers in the UK was, if you want to encourage people to do something, make it easy. And this became the team mantra, make it, because I would say it so often. Okay, the answer is to make it easy. And now, of course, it's not so obvious how to accomplish that. So I think you can get a long way with make it easy and then test. And you don't have to use the word RCT, right? Test, that's it. Make it easy and test. These are easy words. And nobody can be against testing. Now, there is always the danger of people saying, oh, no, I don't want to test whatever is the thing that's going to work best. I just want to do that. And of course, the answer is we don't know. We may have some good guesses, but we're not perfect prognosticators, and there are always surprises, and all of the details matter. So even if there's a general theme of what the change is, there are an infinite number of ways of implementing it. And we need to fine tune exactly what the message is and how it should be delivered. And if it's online, what the interface is going to look like. So people and testing, that's my simple message.
That's very helpful. That's good, clear and concise. And I think, with the testing, I think the field of behavioral science has really started to explore beyond RCTs, particularly with COVID and the limitations on having rapid advice to give to policymakers. You can't always run an RCT when your research question changes day by day sometimes. So yeah, I mean, I think it's been really interesting for the field to think about what testing means in different contexts and places. And making it easy, of course, the EAST framework we're familiar with, and as Cass is talking about now, feast with the fun as well. So yeah, there are lots of ways we can talk about this too. And the other point about behavioral science and kind of understanding how to make it easy, I think there's been some really interesting work across the UN regarding mixing behavioral science with data science, with design, and kind of the more I mean, it's all under the same, it's all mixes in terms of under the same umbrella, but really being truly multi and interdisciplinary in what we do. I think we can really kind of achieve more there. Okay, well, I want to move on to I could talk about this for a while, but I want to move on to the next section. So this is kind of where we came from. Now where we are right now. So as I mentioned, we published this UN behavioral science report with over 100 use cases across the UN, covering a range of topics from health, climate, gender, through to management and administration of the UN itself. So ideas such as sludge, which Cass will talk about on Friday. But one area that came up was also in savings and individual savings behavior. So a couple of studies that were carried out was one by UNFPA, looked at the savings of pregnant women in Uganda. So women would delay care, ultimately leading to high rates of maternal mortality because they didn't have resources. So helping them save money in a way that's meaningful to them. So they helped with commitment devices. They looked at prompts to kind of really help them do that. So just one example of some work that the UN is doing. Another is from UN Global Pulse. They worked with shop owners in Indonesia, and this is actually a project run in partnership with the BIT, where they tried to get people to save the change, kind of round up when they were buying purchases. So with interesting results there. So just two examples. There are others in the report as well, just to kind of highlight some thinking in the UN overall. But it'd be good to get from you, in the area of savings, individual savings, what are some high-level ideas where you think could lead to impact within sort of the variety of contexts the UN works?
Well, I think the two most important principles to employ when thinking about saving, one is self-control. So saving, when you boil it down, is delay of gratification. The only way you can save is by not spending now. And that's difficult. You can go back to Walter Mischel's famous marshmallow experiments with kids, who, if you give them a choice between one marshmallow now and 3 marshmallows in a few minutes, they struggle mightily to wait. And as we get older, most of us overcome that, although obesity is a growing problem around the world. So we all have our marshmallow. So one part of it has to be, again, make it easy. How can we make it easier for people to put off consuming something? And we know that for people who have regular jobs in the formal economy, by far the most successful way of saving is if money is taken out of their paycheck before they see it. So if you don't have it in money in your pocket is very dangerous, and money in your checking account or deposit account is almost as dangerous. So if we take it out, that helps. And the second thing, something that I've been writing about for an embarrassing number of decades, is what I call mental accounting. And the idea is that people put labels on money, and that there's a wonderful video you can find of the actors Dustin Hoffman and Gene Hackman talking about their starving artist days, when Hackman goes to Dustin Hoffman's apartment and Hoffman says he needs a loan of some money. And Hackman goes into Hoffman's kitchen and sees these jars of money and labeled utilities, food, entertainment. And Hackman says, well, why do you need a loan? You have plenty of money. There's money in all these jars. And Hoffman says, well, no, you can't take the money out of the rent jar, put it into the food jar. So, you know, for centuries, people have been organizing their household budgets along those lines. And as we've become more modern, in most modern economies, we've gotten rid of the jars, but we've just replaced it with something else. And so the second step, the first step is getting them not to spend. The second step is putting it somewhere safe, and it has to be just a place where you're slightly less likely to spend it. And everything else follows from those two basic principles. And of course, commitment strategies, you use that phrase, not everybody may know what that means. It means a strategy where you sort of tie your hands. So in the famous scene where Odysseus has his crew tie himself to the mast so he won't steer his ship against the rocks, that's a commitment strategy. The reason Cass and I have titled our new edition, the final edition, is a commitment strategy never to do this again. So we completely rewrote this book, which as far as we can tell, no one has ever been stupid enough to do before. And I'm sure it was a lot of work. And the only reason we did it is there was a pandemic, there was nothing else to do. So, so that's our commitment strategy. Cass doesn't quite believe it, but this is the last one.
Well, that's great. I think some of the work I've also, it's not in the report, but there have been some commitment strategies with buddies, kind of saving money. We've done this in some countries where if you have someone to hold you accountable, it's been helpful to kind of commit to like a healthy behavior or savings or whatever it is.
Yeah, I have a former student, Dean Carlin, who's now at Northwestern, who started this company stick.com, where you and I can make a friendly bet on something that we're going to exercise or lose some weight or something, and we make a bet that we're going to have to pay off the loser, or some if I fail to run my 5K every day, then I have to pay off. These are commitment strategies too.
Yeah, exactly. There's a lot there you could explore. very verbatim strategies. But I wanted to touch upon just a bit more of the UN context. So Elder Shafir and Sandel Mullainathan's work on scarcity and kind of thinking about cognitive bandwidth. And there's been lots of work that's continued on from the book Scarcity in the Space, and I won't try to summarize it all now, but what do you think about how does that weigh into mental accounting when we're thinking about situations where there isn't a lot of cognitive bandwidth? How does that relate to your understanding of mental accounting?
Well, you know, the work that Eldar and Sendel did really stresses the fact that if you are very close to subsistence, then your cognitive load is enormous. And, you know, we all know that there are certain times of our lives, I'm sure this past week and last week, you feel like, how are you possibly going to keep up with everything? Because there's this big conference coming up, and the rest of life somehow still has to go on. And you know, you have you don't want to forget to turn the oven off. So if every day is like that, then people struggle with things that those of us who are in a more affluent situation take for granted. So if paying the utilities or feeding your kids, if you can only do one, then it's a huge handicap. And, you know, I'll go back to make it easy. Those are the people that need most tools for helping them with everyday decisions. Now, obviously, they also need some more money, but simple things like, you know, like farmers who don't put enough fertilizer on their crops, arranging their finances so when they sell this year's crop, some of the money is set aside for fertilizer that will be delivered at the time that you're supposed to put it down. That's going to solve a lot of problems. And notice it involves all the things that we've talked about, right? It's taking that money out of your pocket when you sell the crop and sticking it somewhere into the fertilizer fund, and it'll be there because you don't have access to it. And there will be more maize or whatever it is you're growing next year because you've done it.
No, that's a great example to really illustrate a lot of the things we've talked about already. So thank you for that. Okay, so I'm thinking about now going toward the book and thinking about the future where we're going with behavioral science and kind of leveraging this new book that you and Cass have written. I've noticed that you have a new term in there, this idea of smart disclosure. It'd be great if you could explain what it is, as well as why it matters and why we should care about it, and what's the potential for us to leverage it in the UN system.
Yeah, so every society has a bunch of disclosure rules. You know, if you sell a house, there will be a list of things that you have to reveal to potential buyers. If you take out a loan, there will be a list of disclosures. Now the problem is, if we think about the technology we're using to make those disclosures, it's not even 20th century. It's, I don't know when they invented the first writing instrument, but that's the technology we're using. It's a piece of paper and it's a list. And the problem is regulations just add to the list and produce what, what we call sludge, which Cass is going to talk about on Friday. So surely in the 21st century, we should have ways of disclosing things that are more modern than a piece of paper. And it doesn't matter if it's a PDF form. That's the same technology. It's just on your screen. And so what we've been pushing for, we talked about this a little bit in the first edition, but we give it a very clunky name. So all it means is taking the disclosures and making them electronic. So here's one simple example. In the US, we have all kinds of laws about food labeling. So if I buy a box of cereal, there's a label on the side that lists ingredients and calories and so forth and so on, right? So again, this is first century technology. It's a list. You can imagine that all of that is both online and easily searchable and easily paired with the things you buy. So most grocery stores have some sort of shopping club. Suppose you have a kid with a peanut allergy. If you could just download, just one click, you go to grocerystore.com where you shop and you say, I want to download my last year's of purchases. Not you're going to open that. You just send that over to nopeanuts.com and they say, stop buying these 20 things. And maybe here are these 20 other things that are close substitutes that won't risk your kid's health. So we can do that for everything. I mean, I was on a committee that was trying to devise a mortgage disclosure form. And there was hours and hours spent about how big each number should be and where it should be on the form. And we shouldn't be wasting our time with that. We should just say everything about a mortgage should be in a machine readable file that what we call choice engines, think of travel websites, right? It used to be, if I wanted to fly from Chicago to New York, I had to call a travel agent. Right now, even I, can book a flight online. I mean, I don't have to call my granddaughter to help me with that. So, but choosing a mortgage is really hard. And the whole financial crisis, part of it was that even professional traders that were trading collateralized debt obligations and so forth had no way of knowing what was inside the thing they were trading. So we think a lot could be done by moving into the 21st century, even into the 20th century. So that's what smart disclosure is.
That's really fascinating. I think there's so many implications to that, as you kind of alluded to, only a few of them, but I think once you start to dive in, it could relate to all of the SDGs and progressing on them in different ways and how we interact. I think even like shopping online in the grocery store, there could be much more that websites could do to help, even just on a basic level, to kind of do this, but there's many things there. Yeah, in terms of, dealing with programs and accessing which program and what's been, like, as you said, people who often live in situations of poverty, they don't have the time and capacity to do this, to figure out which program and why. So how can we really share that in a way that's meaningful as well? There's lots we can explore. Yeah, okay. So with that, I think we should go over to some audience questions and answers as we can. So the first question we have here is from Anna, Would you like to ask your question yourself? We can unmute you if you would like, and just tell us where you're from as well. If not, I can also ask it. Okay, I can ask it then. So it's, could you elaborate on the difference between ethical nudging and manipulation? What ensures that interventions fall in the first group and not the second?
Well, you know, from the first time Nudge came out and we started giving book talks, if somebody asked me to sign a copy of the book, I would always sign it Nudge for Good. And I'm sure there are many people on this that have a copy that has my scrawled Nudge for Good on it. And that's because that was a plea. So, you know, we didn't invent human nature. People have been around, and we didn't invent nudging. People have been nudging, you know, since the Garden of Eden, right? So try that apple, it looks good. So all the tools that we suggest can be used for good or evil. And you know, a good example is one of the biggest success stories of behavioral economics is in retirement saving, and it involves automatically enrolling people into the retirement plan so they don't have to fill out a bunch of forms. Now, lots of companies automatically enroll you if you get like a 1 month free trial, or for $1, it has to always be $1, so they get your credit card, and they will automatically renew you at the regular price. Now, there's nothing evil about that. And in fact, automatically think about your utilities. You wouldn't want them to turn it off every year unless you've gone and signed up again. Because if you're like me, that would mean once a year the lights go off. So automatically renewing is fine, but it should be as easy to get out as it is to get in. And what lots of companies have done, news organizations, gyms, streaming services, lots of subscriptions. It's very easy to join and very hard to unsubscribe. And you know, I certainly rant about this whenever possible, including now. I don't know whether we need laws about it. Maybe if it gets too abusive. I'm trying shame as my first line of attack. But so certainly for the UN and for governments, we don't want to be manipulating people. But you know, there's no black and white rule. So if I write down a question, the way I write it will influence what people do. And you may decide that that's manipulation, but the main point of our book has always been there's no neutral way to do it. You have to do it some way. And so we say try to do everything in as helpful a way as possible. And yes, there will be unethical people who will use some of the same tools to exploit people. And part of the role of government is to make life hard on them.
Yes, exactly. I think it's, yeah, it's sort of the gray area of ethics and how do we determine what to do and what to do. So we actually asked a number of entities across the United system how they deal with this in their application of behavioral science. So a lot of them in my work too, we deal with ethical review boards through universities is kind of how we've handled it. But there is talk about kind of the UN thinking more systematically about this and ways we can at least put some guardrails around what we're doing such that we can ensure it's done in a certain way. But you're right with choice architecture, there has to be a choice made. So yeah.
I think I'm hoping we can find some better way of making ethical judgments than internal review boards. That's all I'm going to say about that.
Yeah, no, it would, yeah, definitely. I think it would be
sludge somehow comes to mind.
Yeah, well, I mean, quite frankly, there is demand from the UN colleagues who are doing these work because they don't feel, I mean, not generalized, but some colleagues don't feel like they are secure in what they would like to have a check on what they're doing. So for those, perhaps there's some value add. But
you know, let me give one quick example of this, where the ethics come up and where people have greatly misunderstood our view about something, and that's on organ donation. So in most countries, like in the United States, if you want to donate your organs in the case of death, you have to do something like register as an organ donor, often at the Department of Motor Vehicles when you get your driver's license, but it could be anywhere. Some countries have adopted what's called, somewhat misleadingly, presumed consent, where you're presumed to give your permission unless you opt out. And people wrongly think that Cass and I advocate that, because we talk a lot about defaults, and why wouldn't we want people to be defaulted into being organ donors? Now, and I could go on for 2 hours about this, and I promise not to, but one of the problems is that essentially no country uses that policy. They have that as the name, but it's not the case that if somebody dies in an automobile accident and they haven't opted out, that the hospital immediately takes the organs. Instead, they ask permission from the family, and the family has no idea what the donor's wishes were, because if the donor didn't opt out, they did nothing. And normally our inference from someone doing nothing is to infer nothing. So we advocate something else, and it has a lot to do with our ethical judgment that we shouldn't be presuming someone's consent without asking them. After all, we honor the wishes of the deceased when it comes to things like bequests. So if I'm entitled to decide how my money gets spent if I die, I should be entitled to have a say in what happens to my organs. And presumed consent doesn't actually do that. So, but you're going to have to read the book to find out why.
Yeah,
that's my last plug.
a good hook for everyone to get it when it comes out. Okay, well, thank you for that. We could talk about ethics for a while, but let's go on to the next topic, if that's all right. So there's a question from Punita here. I don't think she's part of the webinar, so I'll just read it. I think it relates to kind of 2 areas, if I'm interpreting it correctly. So nudges work with our individual benefits. How do we use it to benefit a community, and particularly in situations where it takes a long time to see impacts, such as in water pollution or climate change? So it's kind of two issues there.
So, you know, climate change is, as we all know, an existential threat to human beings and the planet. And we're not going to solve it exclusively by nudging. It's too big of a problem. And I and every economist I know think that part of the answer has to be something like a carbon tax. If you don't get the prices right, if I can drive some gas guzzling car and not pay any of the costs of the emissions that I spew, I'm going to emit too much. So step one, you have to get the prices right. And we have to figure out, and this is a UN kind of problem, it's not exactly in their domain, but we need things like the Paris Accord. We need all the countries to agree that they're going to have something like carbon tax or cap and trade, it doesn't matter. So getting the prices right is first. But although it's true that we can't achieve those goals exclusively by nudging, we also can't do it without nudging. So we need behavior change. And getting the prices right is the right first step. But there's a lot we can do to accentuate that. So for example, you know, in some places, the price of electricity varies by time of day. Well, that helps, right? That's the economist's answer. But it may not be very salient. Suppose on a day when there's very high demand, your thermostat starts beeping or your phone starts beeping to tell you, you know, maybe you should turn the air conditioning off, or at least set the thermostat up because it's going to cost you $25 in the next hour to leave it running. So, right, that's not just economics. Setting the price doesn't help if no one notices. So we have to use every tool for all of these big problems, you know, be it COVID, poverty, pollution, crime. There's no one answer. There's every answer.
Yeah, I think that's very helpful to understand sort of the bigger context there about all the ways we can address these questions, these problems. Okay, so next we have a question from Rupsa. Would you like to ask it directly yourself? You can unmute yourself, I believe.
Hello, sir. Good evening. My name is Rupsha. I have just begun working in the development sector. I'm from India. I live in New Delhi. It's an honor and privilege to be here on this webinar, listening to your insights. My question is, due to cultural differences, people psychologically may respond to the same nudge in different ways. So could you please highlight what this tells us about the effectiveness of nudge or nudging behaviors? Thank you.
Sure, thanks, Rupsa. So my last trip out of the country was to India. I was in New Delhi in January of 2020, just before the world ended. So here, there's good news and bad news. The good news is that to a large extent, human nature is universal. And the biggest findings of psychology and behavioral economics are pretty universal. Take the concept of loss aversion, that losses hurt more than gains make you feel good. I don't know of any culture where that's not true. Now, it may vary. Another one is overconfidence. Almost everybody is overconfident, men more than women, and some countries more than others, but the sign of the effect is pretty much the same everywhere. Now, it's also the case that there are strong cultural differences. And what that means is that the same wording of a policy that works in the United States may not work in India, and the same wording that works in New Delhi may not work in Mumbai or Calcutta. So what does that mean? We have to test. And test. They get bored hearing us repeat that, but your point is very well taken. It doesn't mean that that our ideas are useless. It means that they may have to be fine-tuned. And it's just like, politicians around the world are all trying to convince people to vote for them, but you can't give the same speech in Boston as you give in Rome and expect to get elected. So that's why nudging has to be partly localized.
It's a very good point. And one thing that we're actually considering doing in the UN system, given we have data and we have reach across different countries, is to do potentially the idea of mega studies, like Katie Milkman has termed from some of the work that she's done, but really kind of seeing what you're getting at here, exploring a lot of those issues in more detail. So love to hear from you more on that as we go down that track.
But make it easy always works.
Yes, this is the one. If we take one thing away from this webinar, it's to make it easy.
There's no place where making it hard helps.
Yeah, exactly. Okay, so we only have a few minutes left. I just wanted to hopefully give space for a couple more questions. So we have one from Eduardo. I don't know if you'd like to ask it yourself here. Do you want to unmute yourself?
Hi, I'm Eduardo from Brazil, São Paulo, and it's an honor to listen to you. Recently at another event in a panel with Daniel Kahneman and I don't remember who else was there, sorry, but you said, and today also, you said that you are rewriting Nudge. So there is any special discovery that you made that make you to rewrite the book?
Okay, so thanks for that. I think it's funny. The reason why we ended up doing it was a nudge, and it's because of something trivial. The paperback contract for the book had expired, and no one had noticed it. It had expired 18 months earlier before somebody got in touch with us and said, oh, by the way, we have to sign a new contract. And the publisher would like maybe a new chapter on COVID or something. And I picked up the book, and early on, there's a discussion of the spiffy technology called the iPod. Now, we probably can't even remember what an iPod does on an iPad. So, and there were all these things in the book that just seemed out of date. There wasn't all that much to do. So Cass was not convinced about the wisdom of this idea, because in the time it took us to revise this book, he could have written 5 books. But anyway, we decided to do it. There's not one thing. but there's a lot about sludge that Cass will talk about on Friday.
Great, thanks for that. Yeah, there's a lot in there. So we have, I just wanted to, sorry, trying to find the next question. Johanna, could you unmute or could you, Aswini?
Very happy to unmute Aswini.
Yes, thank you.
Hello, Mr. Richard. This is Ashwini from India also. So my question is regarding the base of the pyramid population. I work in Africa and Asia with people who live on less than $1. So my question is, how does nudge and nudge plus strategies apply to these people who are very focused on basic needs like access to clean drinking water, feeding their children? How do you try to influence their behavior when their focus is so basic?
Well, again, the principles are all the same. I mean, and the needs are just accentuated. So the example we were talking about earlier about helping a farmer have the money to pay for the fertilizer 6 months later by putting some of the money aside when the farmer sells the crop. That's something that can work at any level. And the fact that we have very poor people living on a very small budget doesn't mean we can't nudge. It means there's all the more reason we have to. And even some technology solutions are available. Cell phone penetration is very high around the world, not necessarily smartphone, but cell phone, which means things like text messages can work in places in almost everywhere. So the principles are the same, the exact implementation strategies are a little different.
Great, thanks for that. I think
I should also say that there's a huge field of behavioral development, and there was a Nobel Prize to Esther Duflo and Abhijit Banerjee and Michael Kremer a couple of years ago for work in this area. And so there are lots and lots of good people working on those problems.
yes, thank you for that. Yes, there are lots of work out there we could explore. Okay, do you have time to stay for a few more minutes, Professor Thaler, past the hour? Thank you. Okay, so next over to Margaret. Would you like to ask your question?
Hi, yes, I'm a behavioral researcher at Duke University focused on financial decision-making. And a lot of times behavioral science is used to help people to navigate to beneficial choices in imperfectly designed systems. We tend to put a lot of burden on the people to make right decisions and exert self-control. Do you think it's feasible to use behavioral science to encourage powerful system designers, for example, policymakers, lawmakers, corporate executives, to make better systems to begin with that better serve public well-being?
So yes, I think that it's possible to improve the system, the laws to tip the balance a little bit more in favor of consumers. It's also possible for the private sector to help. And there's a company that was started by a former student of mine called Thaler that we talk about in this new book. And what they do is they help people who have accumulated a lot of credit card debt. And very briefly, what they do is you have somebody with 4 credit cards and $20,000 of credit card debt. They take all of that debt on, charge you a lower interest rate, and then manage the payments for you so you never miss a payment. And so you pay down the debt on the highest interest card first, and so forth and so on. So there's a lot of potential for technology to improve decision-making. And, you know, just like I was mentioning before, it's now very easy to book a flight and a hotel, something that 30 years ago you had to pay someone to do. The opportunities for the private sector to, we call these choice engines. The opportunity to create choice engines to help people make better decisions is possible. Now, it's also, there are some risks that the choice engines could be misbehaving, but they're also very easy to monitor. So yes, they could try to steal from you, but you know, if you think about travel websites as choice engines, there are aggregators like Kayak that let you search across all the choice engines. So if one of them is charging you too high a price, you can find out. And so I think, yes, government has a role, but the private sector has a big role. And I'm hoping to see what I call good banks that have a goal of helping their customers, not taking as much money away from them as possible. And whether a good bank can win the battle of competition remains to be seen, but I'd like to see a few more try.
Great, thanks for that. And just I'm gonna squeeze in one last question here. Leonard, would you like to ask your question?
Mary Leonardo just had to leave us, so do you want to take the question for him?
Okay, or okay, well, maybe perhaps the other one that you.
Sure, in that case, let's go to Florian, who's joining us from FAO.
Great.
Florian, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much. My question comes to, you said making it easy is the most important thing. So what can we learn from the private sector who are using really all the tools to make it easy, especially when it comes to a problem like obesity, when we think about it, and ultra processed foods being advertised everywhere, available everywhere, and also people perceiving them as affordable everywhere. So what do you think can we learn from the private sector for good, nudging for good? Thank you.
Well, look, I think that for a lot of these things, technology can be our friend. So for example, diabetes is a problem all around the world. And it is very much a self-control problem. Because if you eat the right foods and take your medicines, the chance of you being healthy are very high. Now, the technology exists to put something in your body that will constantly monitor your blood sugar and adjust it. And those are part of the tools that we should be using. And diabetes is so expensive for the healthcare system to deal with that it would massively pay for itself to just use these new technological skills. So I'm a big proponent of technological solutions because, you know, let's go back to what are the problems? People can't solve really hard cognitive problems, and then they have self-control problems, so they look at that dessert and they can't resist. And well, we can help, and if there's a technology, you know, think about the Fitbit, which is a very basic, already obsolete technology that just started buzzing when you had manage to take 10,000 steps. You know, I know people who were sort of walking around their living room when they had gotten up to 9,600 because they wanted to get that buzz. So if we can, you know, I have an Apple Watch. Imagine the possibilities for this technology. And so I think there are lots of opportunities for the private sector to help. And using technology for good can help a lot.
Great, thank you so much for that. I think after this I'm gonna have to go for a walk because I share my steps with my friends, so we keep each other accountable. If I don't hit my 10,000, I get a bunch of WhatsApp messages telling me that I should be doing it. So
yeah, get out.
yeah, get out and keep going. I'll go down the stairs a few times. It does it. But thank you so much. It's been really insightful, the discussion today. We've had a few questions, covered a lot of topics across the UN system. Very much appreciate your time. Encourage colleagues on the call to join the other events of UN Behavioral Science Week and join the UN Behavioral Science group. And thank you very much again for your time, Professor Thaler, and looking forward to engaging with you as we go forward in this journey across the UN. Absolutely,
Mary. Very nice to meet you and Joanna, and thanks to everyone around the world for tuning in. A very international audience, and nudge for good.
Thanks so much, and make it easy as well. It's other thing takeaway of this webinar too. Great, thank you so much, Professor Thaler. Talk to you later.
Bye-bye.
Bye.